Bill Cullina, the Executive Director here at the Morris Arboretum, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about the birds and the bees, and flowers too. Really, the birds and the bees from the flowers perspective, more specifically pollination and how to make sure your plants set seed if you want seeds, and what to look for, maybe even do some of your own hybridization. So come on along and let's learn a little bit about pollination.
We're looking here at the flower of celandine poppy, Stylophorum diphyllum, which is actually in the poppy family, and it's an insect pollinated flower. You can tell that right away by the beautiful color. Insect pollinated flowers typically are colorful: yellows, purples, whites, reds, although some colorful flowers can be pollinated by birds, like hummingbirds too, but insects do the majority of the pollination here in the temperate world. And an insect pollinated flower like this is partly the petals are for advertisement. So a bee, which doesn't see very well from a distance, is flying around and sees this big bright spot and is drawn right into the center of that spot to pollinate the flower. Why is the bee coming? Well, in this case, if you look here, you see this ring, this ruffly ring around the center of the flower. Those are the anthers, which are the pollen-bearing organs of the flower, the male part of the flower. And in this case, what the bee is doing is landing on here and collecting a lot of this pollen to take back and to use as a protein source for its young. And so the celandine poppy produces a lot of pollen, realizing that some of the pollen is going to be eaten, but hopefully the bee then goes to another flower and takes some of that pollen and accidentally dabs it right here, which is the stigma of the flower, which is the part of the female part of the flower, and starts the pollination process. Now some flowers, in fact many flowers, also have a sugar reward for the insect, nectar, and in that case the nectar would be down at the base of the flower. And nectar is a cheaper reward than pollen. It takes a lot less energy for the plant to make sugar water, basically, than to make a protein-packed pollen, and the plant needs that pollen to accomplish reproduction too. So many plants will try to fool the bee into just taking nectar and ignoring the pollen. But in the case of celandine poppy, the pollen is part of the reward. So if you can see, when I go in and touch this like this, what's happening is I'm collecting little pollen grains on my paintbrush, and if I were the bee, I'd take these to another flower and pollinate them. But once the bee pollinates, gets a little bit of that pollen on this stigma, which is sticking out here, and it's very sticky, those pollen grains actually sprout and go down, send a tube down into this structure right here, which is the ovary, which is basically sort of the womb of the flower, where all the latent seeds are, and then those are then sexual recombination happens, and they begin growing into seeds and form a pod. And so this ovary right here starts to swell and grow as the seeds mature, and I'll show that to you next. Okay, so I've picked one of the seed capsules or seed pods from the celandine poppy. So this is one from a flower that's probably bloomed 2.5 weeks ago, and this is the remains of the stigma here. So this is where the pollen was dabbed, and the pollen germinated on here, sent tubes down into this ovary, which then each pollen grain found one unfertilized seed and one fertilized ovule and pollinated that, and each one of those started growing into a seed. So now if I open up this capsule, you can see the yellow sap that celandine poppy has, and inside there are a whole bunch of developing seeds. So I'm counting, I would guess there's probably 50 seeds in there. could be wrong, maybe more, but a lot of seeds. So basically, remember, each one of those was a single pollen grain growing down here, finding in its journey, finding an unfertilized seed, and then fertilizing it, and then that's able to grow into a seed. So these seeds are very white, and if you touch them, they'd be very soft. They're not mature yet. I would say these seeds need at least a couple more weeks before they mature, at which point this capsule will split open on its own and drop the seeds down to the ground. And you can't tell yet because they're not quite developed, but these seeds actually have a little appendage on there that emits the smell of a dead insect and is very attractive to ants, and ants will take these celandine poppy seeds, carry them back to their nests, and basically feed that appendage to their young and plant the seed. So celandine poppies are one of the many woodland species that are ant dispersed, but this is just kind of getting started here. So I just mentioned about the idea that some flowers try to prevent bees or other insects from robbing the pollen out of the flower, and instead provide nectar as a sugary reward for being the pollinator for the flower. And it's a great example here in bleeding heart. I think something that you probably recognize, bleeding heart flowers. These very interesting shape, very unlike the symmetrical shape of the celandine poppy, but in fact it's still made up of petals with the sexual parts of the flower too. But you can see here when I took one and pulled off one of the set of petals there, and you can see this complicated shape on the inside. So this is designed to, the bee lands here and then drills down in here to drink nectar. And there's no pollen down there. The pollen is up here, and you can see as the bee is working, it's working on this little column here, and it bumps up against, and whoop, up pops that pollen, and then shuts again so the bee can't find it. So as the bee's in there working like this, it's having pollen rubbed on its belly, and then when the bee goes to try to find the pollen, oh, it's gone again. So great way to prevent the insect from robbing the pollen. And you can also see that with this bleeding heart, the amount of pollen in there is much, much less, and the female part of the flower is on that column structure too, so the bee will take pollen from one and transfer it to the other. And you might say, well, why doesn't the bee just, why doesn't the pollen just go right on to the stigma right there and it's done? Why do you need the bee? Well, obviously the plant could self-pollinate, but then you run into problems with lack of genetic diversity and inbreeding and that sort of thing. So many plants have a mechanism by which they can distinguish their own pollen from another member of their species. It's almost like the pollen has a genetic barcode that when the pollen lands on the stigma, the plant is able to tell, this is my pollen, I'm just going to ignore it, or this is a pollen from another member of my species, or even a related plant in the same genus, and will stimulate that pollen to start growing. And so in that sense they can prevent inbreeding and foster outbreeding. And so it brings up a point that if you are growing plants in your garden and you want them to self-sow, then you need to plant more than one of an individual to get the seed. Now I'll look here, and I've got a few seed capsules from this, and my guess is like the celandine, the seeds are in there, but they're not quite ripe yet. They're sort of you can see that one right there, still white. And just coincidentally, the bleeding hearts, this is Dicentra spectabilis, also are ant dispersed, and will develop that little structure called an elaiosome that the ants will want to take away. I saw this beautiful crested iris blooming here in the Widener Woods, and just wanted to point this one out. This is another deceitful flower. So if you look at this, I would even think, oh, look at all that pollen there, wow. The reality is, this isn't pollen, this is just the coloration of the petals. And this is designed to fool the bees into thinking they've landed on the mother lode of pollen. They land on here and realize, oh, there's really no pollen there, but then they can go down underneath and there's some nectar in there, but that's where the sexual parts are, way down in the center of that flower. And so the bee, once again, doesn't get any pollen, but does get a little nectar reward. But in this case, this beautiful coloration, this crest of the crested iris, is there to fool the bee into thinking it's found something that it hasn't. This unassuming inflorescence here is the inflorescence of one of our many native sedges, species in the genus Carex. And sedges, like grasses and many trees, are wind pollinated versus insect or bird pollinated. It is, they depend on the wind to catch and carry pollen from one individual to the receptive stigma of another individual. And wind pollination has been around much longer than insect pollination. Plants evolved before, land plants evolved before there were insects to pollinate for the most part. So wind pollination is an older strategy, and it's still an effective strategy, but you tend to find it in places like this meadow we're in, where it's open, there's a lot of wind. Certainly a lot of our native trees use this method because they're tall and they can drop pollen into the wind and it can be carried great distances. You know, if you parked under a pine tree, in a few weeks from now you'll notice that it's dropping a lot of pollen on you because your car turns yellow. So one of the drawbacks to wind pollination is that it requires, obviously, the plant to produce a lot more pollen, because it's really a needle in a haystack situation where that pollen grain is going to be carried and then happen to find just that right place, just that right receptive stigma to accomplish pollination. The other problem with wind pollination is that not only do you need to produce a lot of pollen, but what if the wind's blowing the wrong way when you drop your pollen and blows it out to sea or over a pond or into the mountains or somewhere where it's not going to be effective? So especially in places where there's less wind, the understory of forests, places like that, you don't find as much wind pollination because the wind can be less, and insects are much more effective at distributing the pollen. There, you produce a lot less pollen for the sort of targeted effect. The drawback is you got to spend more of your resources in producing those big colorful flowers. You can see this sedge flower, you wouldn't hardly even notice if you're walking by, but if I point to it, you've got up here, this is where the anthers were. This is the male part of this inflorescence. And then down here are these little white things, are the stigmas that are coming out of the unfertilized seeds. Sedges have this very unique structure called a periginium, which is a sac that surrounds the unfertilized seed, and as the seed develops, the periginium sort of swells as a sort of protective jacket around the seeds. And sedges are very difficult to identify. You have to really be a botanist to tell one from the other, but some of the cues that you look for are whether the shape of these various parts, whether the male parts, the anthers, are above the female parts of the flower, the shape of the periginium. All these things play into identifying which sed is which. But here you've got this one. The pollen here has already shed, and the stigmas are now receptive. So this is another way that plants can prevent inbreeding, where they have usually the pollen ripens and is dispersed before the stigmas on that particular plant are ripe. And so what it's hoping is that there's another one nearby who's a little bit behind, and the pollen will be ripe in time to pollinate these stigmas. So I'll go down and see if I can find another one just to show you that. Sure enough, here's one that I'm holding where it's a little less far along, and you can see that on top there, the anthers are still emerging out there and dropping pollen, as the stigmas are not quite mature and receptive yet. Now, plants that can't pollinate themselves are called self-incompatible, and it makes sense. And many garden plants have that characteristic. They can't pollinate themselves and that's, as I said, to encourage outbreeding. But one problem that you have if, say, you are a gardener and you're on a budget and you just buy one plant of a certain species variety, thinking that, oh, it'll set some babies, make some seed, and I can propagate those. Well, you're not going to get any seed. And another thing that's very common in the horticultural trade is breeders will find a superior individual and they will propagate that clonally by dividing it up, by putting it in a tissue culture, and that usually will have a cultivar name on it, like Special Beauty in quotes, or Pink Surprise, or Luscious Lemon, all kinds of names like that. And that's a cue that is a clone, and so you can have one of those or 100 and have them all planted together, and if they're self-incompatible, then you won't get any seed. And here's an example. This is a hellebore. This is one of the Christmas roses, Helleborus niger. And it looks like these are the old flowers. This bloomed way back in January, February. The old flowers here, and it looks like, wow, those are the seed pods, basically the seed capsules of this flower. These are the remains of the petals that sort of hang in there, the sepals. And you'd think, well, I'm going to get some seeds out of there, but I'm going to take this and open it up, and you can see that even though it's formed seed capsules, there are no fertilized seeds in there. It basically rejected its own pollen and didn't set any seed, because all we have here in this planting of about 14 different plants are one clone. Okay, I picked one of these and I'm going to open this up. And you can see, well, it looks like there's seeds in there. Those look like they're viable seeds. Well, I'll be honest, if you don't know what you're looking for, you might think that those are good seeds, because they sort of look like little seeds in there. So some of this is experience and knowing what to zoom in a little bit on that, what to look for. So I have here a capsule from another of the same species that had several individuals in it, and set viable seeds, so you can see the difference. Well, okay, now when I see them side by side, I can tell. So a little of this is doing some research and knowing what to look for, but you can see that the ovules were in this one, but because it was a clone, they never completed pollination, whereas in this pod over here you had several genetic individuals growing side by side, and they managed to get some seeds. So now I can take that seed and plant it. I want to point out, since I'm here, I've got another hellebore pod that I'll show you. That is, this is a different species. This is one of the Helleborus orientalis hybrids, so it blooms a little bit later rather than blooming in January and February. This is more like February and March. And those seeds obviously are forming, but they're still white. And this is an important thing if you're collecting seeds. The cue that the seed is mature and ready to harvest is that the seed coat darkens up. So these, if you pick them now, that's a sign that the embryo that's inside the seed, the little baby plant, is not mature enough to leave the mother's womb, so to speak, and won't survive. Once the seed coat starts to darken up and it gets hard too, that's the sign that the embryo has fully come to term and will survive outside the mother. Now, just coincidentally, this is yet another ant-pollinated plant. So I'm going to zoom in on the seeds of the ripe ones and talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so I've zoomed in on this seed capsule, this follicle here, and you can see the seeds inside. And now that the seed coat is that dark brown, blackish brown, and that's a jacket that protects the baby embryo and its resources inside. But that white stripe that you can see down the side of the seed, that is the thing that the ants are attracted to. So hellebores, like the celandine poppy, like the bleeding hearts, and many other woodland species that ripen in the spring, things like trilliums and marybells and hepaticas, and I could give you a long list, are dispersed by ants like this, and so the seeds will drop down to the ground and the ants will carry this away and replant them. And now I bring this up because if you've gone to all the work of finding your seeds, collecting your seeds, maybe even pollinating, then you want to make sure that you treat your seeds well. And as a general rule, these ant dispersed species that ripen up early in the year, you can't treat them the way you would tomato seeds or many other common seeds, in that you can't just pick them and put them in a paper bag and forget about them for 6 months and then plant them. You need to plant them right away. So that's why if you've ever bought hellebore seeds just in a seed packet and tried to grow them, you probably failed. But if you grow hellebores and you have several clones so they set seed, you'll find babies around the base of the plant. So with these hellebore seeds, the best thing to do, and this is true of bleeding hearts and celandine poppies and all the others I mentioned, is to just collect those seeds when they're ripe and plant them right away, or let them fall down around the parents and then look for the babies the next year. One other interesting thing about self-incompatibility is that since many garden plants are self-incompatible, and often you might have just one clone of a particular species in your garden, but grow other related species nearby, you can often get spontaneous hybrids, that is, hybrids that come about because the plant rejects its own pollen, but if a related species pollen happens to get onto its flowers, often that will set viable seed and you'll get hybrid offspring. Epimedium is a good case in point. Epimediums tend to be self-sterile, but if you have a number of related ones growing side by side, you can get some interesting hybrids coming out of them. And so you can actually do your own sort of backyard breeding. There are a lot of people that breed things like hostas and daylilies, but you can breed lots of different garden plants if you know a little bit about compatibility and that sort of thing. Self-incompatible plants are a good place to start because you're not worrying about the plant already being pollinated by its own pollen, and so what you get won't be hybrid. So good place to start with things that are self-incompatible. And there's a lot of information online. If you type in words like epimedium self-incompatible, you'll find information about that. But we're going to look at how to go about that. Now, obviously you can't take something like this ranunculus and put it in the focus there and use that to pollinate epimedium. You have to be fairly closely related species to be successful, and not all closely related species will produce viable hybrid offspring. It's really sort of a trial and error thing. The chromosomes have to line up just right. Certain genera or families of plants, like the orchids for example, are very easily hybridized, and you can cross distantly related species and get hybrids and cross hybrids to species and that sort of thing. So it depends on the group of plants and how flexible they are, but generally a first generation hybrid that is crossing two species together is your best bet at getting viable seed out of it. Well, I've removed these from the plants for demonstration's sake. I think it stands to reason that you wouldn't want to do this if you're actually trying to get seed, but here I've got two different epimediums. I've got stellulatum and a grandiflorum cultivar. I don't know that these will produce viable seed together, but just to show you what would happen. Now, the easiest, you can do this with a paintbrush, or you can just take a spray of flowers off and do it that way, but basically you want to have them kiss and basically get the pollen that you see there and the pollen on that long beak that's coming out of the other flower to exchange and basically deposit. The stigmas of epimediums are sort of down hidden under the pollen, so you just have to sort of jab. It's maybe a little easier with a paintbrush, but basically that's the process, and just go around and do a number of flowers that way. And then typically people will tie a little piece of thread or a little piece of flagging tape or some way of marking the stem that that's one that you pollinated, and just make notes about it and make sure you mark it. I've been guilty of going to the trouble of cross-pollinating things and then not marking the stem and then forgetting which is which, and it's really hard to find them. So I like to use little pieces of flagging tape that I can cut and then tie farther down on the stem here so that later on in the season, when the capsules ripen up, I can be looking for them. And epimediums have seed capsules similar to what we were looking at with the dicentra. I don't know if it's in focus there, but you can at least see those are not ripe yet, but they're small seed capsules that when the seeds are ripe, they open up and drop the seeds. So you have to just kind of keep an eye on those and pick them when they're getting ready to shed. You may also find that you have to hand pollinate certain species that could even be native species to North America but aren't growing in their natural range and don't have the correct pollinator. I've had that problem with trilliums. This is what I'm guessing is a yellow form of Trillium cuneatum, or another species, Trillium luteum, and you can tell by smelling it, but I haven't done that. And I haven't had much luck often getting seeds on this because whatever beetle species I'm guessing it is that pollinates this, we don't necessarily have. So I'll just take a paintbrush and dab it in there and then transfer that pollen to another of its kind to get good seed set. So even if the bees are active, you may not get seed set depending on if the particular pollinating species, which could be a beetle, could be a bee, could be a mosquito, could be a fly. You don't have that particular species in your area, you won't get seed. Well, I thought instead of just showing you little flowers, I'd show this pollination technique on something that you can actually see. So got this beautiful Paeonia rockii cultivar here, Rox peony, and look at all those anthers in there. You can see how my finger just turns yellow from there. So basically, peonies are self-incompatible. If I want to cross-pollinate this, you can do it with your finger, take some of that pollen from this plant and then take it to another one, and then that center knob in the middle of the flower, let's move this out of the way, just dab it there, and that's the mass of stigmas, and then that will develop into a seed capsule with the seeds will ripen in the fall.